Um, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, and welcome to Cornet Carolina's first virtual educational program. This is Selecting a Headquarters Charlotte edition. I'm John Christenberry with Cushman & Wakefield and chair of the Cornet Carolina's program committee and sit on the board. We're in extraordinary times, and I want to first start out by saying I hope you and all your family and loved ones are safe and healthy. As we get started, I want to thank our annual sponsors that you saw scrolling through the screen. Special thanks to our diamond sponsors, JLL, CBRE, and DPR. You mean so much to our chapter. We could not have been the #1 Cornet chapter globally without all of our sponsors' help. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items for Zoom. Please mute your computers now if you haven't already. The format of this, there will be the chat where we will field questions and then get those answered by our esteemed panelists towards the end. The session also is being recorded so that you can pass those along, view it later on. And then once you have the opportunity, if you're not already, you can follow the Carolina's Cornet chapter on LinkedIn if you aren't already doing so. So Charlotte, over the past couple of years, has experienced incredible success with landing major headquarters announcements, big jobs announcements. You have both Honeywell and Truist, Fortune 500 companies selecting Charlotte to be their home. And you have Lowe's and Better.com. They've made big jobs announcements, over 1,000 employees each. And so we're excited to have a star-studded panel to discuss why Charlotte has been so successful, but also what does the process look like when you're selecting a city to be your home, whether it's your headquarters or a regional headquarters. But before we proceed, I just want to thank all of the sponsors again and the volunteers that were able to make today's event possible. The Cornet Programs Committee team did a fantastic job setting this up, so big round of applause and thank you there. Now I'm going to pass the mic along to our new and incoming president for the Cornet Carolinas chapter, Anna Marshall with Red Hat.
And welcome everyone, wherever you are. I want to echo John's sentiments. First and foremost, we hope that you ones are healthy and safe. I know that many of you are supporting frontline workers, whether it's a family member or a loved one, or through the work that you're doing with your companies. Thank you enough for all that you're doing. I mean, we truly are in unprecedented times. And I want to thank the Charlotte Programs Committee for organizing this event and our speakers for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us today. It's hard to believe that just 2 months ago, the Cornet Carolinas board came together in person to discuss our goals and objectives for 2020, as we do every year. While our drive to maintaining the Chapter of the Year title was evident and is still evident, our focus was on how we can deliver value to our members, our community, and our sponsors with a theme around creating meaningful connections. Whether that be connecting our members to their next big idea, the future generation and young leaders to the corporate real estate profession, or our business stakeholders and partners that we work with every day to the value of corporate real estate. I don't think any of us really would have anticipated how important that theme would be as we find ourselves working remotely, interacting with our coworkers virtually, and some of us even waving to family members from cars as we have drive-by birthday celebrations. So while the idea of physical connection feels foreign to some of us, our Cornet community has been extremely resilient in strengthening these relationships. Already in the month of April, we've had 2 virtual networking events and a 5-topic coaching series with Pro Advisor Performance Coach at DrinkCon, who I want to give a special thank you to, along with Brett Frenier with Ratio Architects in Raleigh for organizing. On each of these calls, we've had the opportunity to reconnect with people all over the Carolinas and meet others I or others might not have had a chance to meet if it was just a Raleigh or a market specific event. So I think our ability to leverage technology truly has led us to making this market just a bit smaller and our connections a little more authentic. But before we begin today's program, there are a couple of Coronet updates I'm going to share with you. First, I want to make sure that you're aware of the COVID-19 that Coronet Global has created, so you can take advantage of them as much as I have. And to the robust resource page that they've linked on their website, they're also hosting 30-minute pop-up webinars on COVID-19 with 3 options each week, depending on your zone or your location. So for any of you who have questions about a return to office strategy, specific tactics that you're trying to work through with your team, this actually is a really great opportunity to have open discussions with industry peers from all over the world. And this is not member specific, so anyone can join these calls. Also, thank you to those of you who have signed up to participate in the Coronet Global Hackathon, a COVID-19 virtual ideation experience. We have had some incredible thought leadership in this market, and I'm so thrilled to see the individual participation on global teams, but also how supported the Carolinas Hackathon team focused on the distributed work topic is, led by Jenna Geigerman with Citrix. We've got some diverse representation and backgrounds on this team from companies like DPR, Perkins & Will, Atrium Health, Cisco, Heapy, Bandwidth, Gensler, Red Hat Little, and Cushman & Wakefield. Keep an eye out for the summary reports that will be available from these global teams at the end of May. We'll include this in our weekly email. And last, certainly, but not least, I'm excited to share that we have 5 new incredible board members joining the Carolinas board this year. Mendy McNeil with Truist, Brad Divens with Wells Fargo, Jessica Douglas with Heapy, Christopher Kubala with CBRE, and Lalana Griffin. So please join me in welcoming them to the Carolinas board. I'm really excited about today's program, Selecting an HQ Charlotte edition. I think there's no better time to discuss the power of the workplace. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mendy McNeil to introduce our panelists.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mindy McNeil with Truist. I'm very excited to be here today to introduce our panelists that are joining us for this special presentation around selecting a headquarters Charlotte edition. This obviously hits home for us here at Truist, and we're very honored to have my teammate Heath Campbell, Regional President for the Metro Atlanta region, which includes Charlotte, with us today, as well as Janet Labar, President and CEO of the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance, and Seth Martindale, Senior Managing Director with CBRE, their location incentives group. So welcome, panelists, to the event, and we look forward to hearing from all of you today. Thank you.
Great. I think we can forward to the slide. Great, so welcome everybody, and thanks Coronet for inviting us here today to have this fantastic discussion about why Charlotte and the headquarter edition. I'm going to just back up for a second and give everyone some table setting. The Charlotte Regional Business Alliance is the bi-state, 15-county regional economic development organization that really exists to advance a healthy, vibrant, innovative economy. We do this primarily through marketing, business, advocacy, and talent. And today we're going to talk mostly about business and maybe how we position the Charlotte region for more investment. And we're going to hear from Seth and Heath very shortly. But I thought it'd be insightful to share with you some of the research that the Alliance did last fall among site selection consultants and C-level executives. We had about a 22% response rate. We invited something like 200 folks. We had more than 50 respondents, and then we dug down a little bit deeper and had 18 more qualitative interviews with the C-suite execs and site selection consultants. So the key takeaways here is that in the site selection process, there are some key factors that primarily drive that. And that typically has been talent or real estate, with, again, some secondary factors like quality of life being other drivers that support kind of those initial factors of talent and real estate. You know, one of the other things that we're seeing at the Alliance, and it was validated in the survey, is that site selectors and executives have indicated that their timelines for making an expansion decision have been actually ramped up. I know when I started in this work about 18 years ago, it was something like 6 to 36 months was maybe the time frame, and we've seen that really shorten, where companies are looking to make an investment decision within 6 to 8 months. And then, I'll close out this slide by saying that incentives have not been the primary driver, but instead it really is more of a leveling of the playing field. And that is certainly an interesting piece for us here in the Charlotte region, because we actually cross the Carolinas. So there's very different incentives and economic development approaches when it comes to both states being on different sides of that. Okay, so let me go to the next slide if we can. And just quickly, this slide essentially sums up that from the site selector perspective and the C-level executives, the role of an economic development organization is really valuable throughout the process. So it's not just at the front end or in the back end, where an organization like the Alliance or local government, or even the state, Department of Commerce's or EDPNC play a role. Really, the role that we provide in terms of providing research, connecting them to other companies they might want to talk to understand the hiring landscape, utility partners, the real estate community. Really, we can demonstrate value throughout the process. Okay, next slide. And then here we get a little bit more quantitative, if you will, in terms of how Charlotte stacks up against our competition. So I should note that we forced a peer set here. You can see the markets below on that more bluish greenish chart there. Everything from Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas down all the way to Denver is typically the markets that we see the Charlotte region compete against when it comes to projects. Now again, this varies by industry. So maybe in the technology side, we might see stronger competition from Austin. And then on the manufacturing side, for example, we might see more competition from Columbus, and then other markets there in between. So these are also metro areas. I know it says city, but by and large, Atlanta and Dallas consistently rate very strongly and very well. Those markets are obviously very much bigger than the Charlotte region, but strong markets nonetheless with a deep corporate bench set to them. Nashville, we believe Nashville is the hot city, as Austin was not that long ago. So we'll see if Nashville can continue its streak. And then Columbus made the list really because they've done a great job aligning their strategy around brand and then transforming their physical space as a region. They also have a really great corporate leadership pool, and they have Ohio State University and some really great higher education institutions in their backyard. But what you can see in here and by this chart is that, we don't show up in the top 3. So the Charlotte region currently in this peer set ranks 4th overall. And then I think I've got one more slide that we can go over. So this one really just shows where we land in terms of those decision factors when it comes to site selection. So let me focus first on incentives, talent, and real estate. We don't, again, place in the top 3. Rather, we land in somewhere between 4th and 6th, depending on what we're talking about being a driving factor in terms of incentives or real estate. These aren't bad to be not to be in the top 10, certainly we're ranking there, but we do rank lower than some of our competitors when it does come to these being a primary driving factor. I would say we place better when it comes to overall strategic value, and we might hear a little bit more from Seth about that, but that really comes down to a collective set of site selection decision factors that might go beyond just an incentives play or just a talent play or just a real estate play. So when you think about proximity to your customer base, when you think about overall quality of life or cost of doing business, cost of living, when it comes to the strategic value of why a company needs to be in a certain location, Charlotte actually does really well. We know that being in the pretty much the center point of the East Coast is a strategic advantage that we have geographically. So, the Carolinas sit very well, and Charlotte's going to do just fine if we have anything to do with it. Okay, I think I might have a closing slide. Yeah, so this one I'll just highlight here. The takeaway on this one is really that, again, our proximity, our strategic location, and then the fact that we have a perceived value to draw a diverse type of workforce. So whether it's the white collar jobs or if it's that more technical skill set, perhaps that exists among our manufacturing community, we are a region that can offer a wide gamut of a really skilled, talented, and educated workforce. And then you can see in that little chart there that some of our biggest strengths, no question, is in Charlotte Douglas, the ability to access global markets and domestic markets out of this fantastic asset. I know none of us are traveling right now, but when we get into the post-pandemic era, we hope to see Charlotte Douglas again, take that seat as the 6th largest airport and busiest airport in the world. And then you can see, factoring down from there, the availability of the workforce, affordability, quality of life, et cetera. Charlotte's got a really good mix of factors, as the quote indicates there below. So I think that's it for my slide. I'm going to actually ask, before we get into questions, Seth and Heath to talk a little bit more in doing an introduction for themselves. And I will yield right now and ask Heath to give us a little bit more of an introduction.
Thanks, Janet, and thanks everyone at Cornet for including us today. I've had the privilege and honor and very proud to represent over 2,000 teammates at Truist that are relocating here to Charlotte as part of our announcement that Truist chose Charlotte to be our headquarters going forward. We have a very distinctive and intentional distribution model of financial services that differentiates ourselves from all the regionals and national banks. We're now the 6th largest financial services company in the United States. We now can bring Wall Street to Main Street through investment banking that meets the community bank. We believe it's really critical that our clients, at the forefront of what they want in a financial services partner, is to earn their trust. We think in this day and age, certainly going through COVID-19, technology is going to play a critical role. Yes, we want to provide those technological platforms, but our clients demand it. So we need to make sure we meet up with those demands. But we don't think you can separate the importance of the local touch. Through technology and touch, we believe is how you earn and sustain trust with our clients. That distribution model of the 6th largest bank is broken up into 24 community banks. And so my name is Heath Campbell. I'm the regional president of one of those 24 community banks, which is the Charlotte Metroliner region. I'm very proud to be part of the headquartered region here and look forward to be part of the panel.
Great, thanks Heath. We're so glad that you joined us today. And Seth, let's come right over to you.
Sure, thank you. I work for CBRE's location incentive practice, and basically we're responsible for helping companies figure out where to go and why to go there. So, as you can imagine, given the slides you've shown before, I've been to Charlotte quite a few times. I was actually trying to do the math on how many times I've been to North Carolina. And I live in California, but I think I've been to North Carolina over 100 times. So quite a bit of time there. Anyway, I'm glad to be here and just kind of happy to talk about how it stacks up against other communities and states, and provide some context there as well.
That's great. Thank you both. And actually, Seth, I'm going to just stay with you for a second. So based on the survey information that I just shared, and knowing that you've got a lot of experience in this area, how does that information land on you?
I mean, it's not surprising, I guess is what I would say. I mean, Charlotte's been a popular destination for a variety of different companies from a variety of different industries. And I think that's one of the reasons why it does really well, is that it's not only, a lot of people think of Charlotte as just as financial services, but that's not the case. I mean, it really is a diverse skill set that's there, and that's why a variety of companies have gone there. What I would say that I think is actually kind of interesting and might be worth noting is a lot of the cities that you had on your list, Dallas and Nashville in particular, have seen a lot of success over the last, let's call it 10 years. Mm-hmm. Also gotten very expensive. So, we always used to look at how expensive Dallas was versus California. 10 years ago, it used to be about 20% cheaper than California. Now it's about on par. So it's gotten close. And, that's just for wages. Housing is obviously different. But, certain cities like Charlotte and even Atlanta to an extent have been able to keep their prices low. So, basically as Dallas and Nashville have gotten more expensive, Charlotte's been able to keep that, high quality of labor, but a low cost of living and really high quality of life. And if you have all those three things together, it's sort of the perfect formula for companies that want to venture into a new city.
Yeah, and that's tricky, to make sure that we're monitoring the overall cost of living. And I think in a growth market like the Charlotte region, when we're seeing something like 100 people a day moving here, it gets to be, one of those things that you want to keep an eye on, because as market pressures lend themselves, I mean, you're in California, so as as more folks get there, the cost of living, and then eventually the cost of doing business can actually escalate. So it's one of the things we got to be mindful of. I
Yeah, I
think
mean,
not that long ago, Nashville was also affordable.
right. I mean, I would say that's probably the most depressing part about my job coming from California is that I have to go look and see what you can buy a house for in other areas of the country, like North Carolina or Texas or whatnot. And sometimes it's really tough to take, but it is what it is. So
It's true. That's true. All right, Heath, help us understand Truist's decision on why Charlotte for your headquarters, and then share with us a little bit more about the process to selecting Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks, Janet. I think there's a lot of strategic components that went into selecting Charlotte, but quite honestly, when you put together 250 years of organizational background between SunTrust and BB&T, now Truist, there's a reason why merger of equals typically don't work. And the three most heavily contested factors really boils down to leadership, location, and name. When you combine those two, certainly we went into this, and one of the most thriving economic expansions in the history of the United States. Thank goodness we put those together, is for very much a client-centric model to complement local with technology. But thank goodness we kind of went into this financial crisis where our hearts and minds continue to be with all the clients, teammates, neighbors, and communities that are impacted by this. Going into this from a financial strength position gives us a chance to weather that storm. But when you put these two mergers of equals together, most heavily contested, leadership, location, and name. Now we have density and scale to really localize that in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast, where we feel like we're strategically positioned because all the forecasts would indicate population and economic growth. It looks very favorable in the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast relative to the broader United States, where we can have concentration of efforts in that specific geography. So when we did all that, you could look at Atlanta. It's certainly one of those names that popped up on your board that Seth and you shared, but the reality is it couldn't be that. There had to be a neutral spot for all merger of equals. So our leadership team now consists of 14 executive leaders, 7 from Heritage SunTrust, 7 from BB&T. Our name, as much as it was heavily contested, quite honestly, it couldn't be a combination of 2 heritage names. We had to come up with something new. Truist is certainly that name, and certainly is an aspirational name and something we wear as a badge of honor to live up to that aspirational name each and every day. And the location, when you take a look at that, the criteria that you look for value, for talent, clearly the workforce was here with an educated financial services, a talented base. And then the commercial real estate, it was very fortunate that we had access to what we now were able to now call the Truist Center, right here in the center of the financial district of Charlotte, the second largest financial services district or city in the entire United States. But as Seth alluded to, as much as we have a strong presence of financial services, and Janet, with your background with the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance, financial services only represents 12% of the broader economy of Charlotte. So it's much more than that. And financial services, we're a byproduct of the communities that we serve. So you need all industries, all neighbors, all communities thriving in order to really optimize your platform for the markets that you serve. So I think if you look at the Mid-Atlantic and Southeast now, where we have predominantly number 1 or number 2 market share across the Southeast and the major metropolitan markets that we serve in, but acknowledge there's a lot of very difficult and strong competition that we compete with each and every day. We think we have the size and scale to invest in technology, but the efficiencies that come with that scale to sustain it. And you take a look at, I've had the great fortune now with 17 years with Heritage BB&T, now Truist, 20 years in financial services to work in incredible markets, whether it's in Washington, D.C., the state of Kentucky, and the last 4 years working in Atlanta, responsible for the state of Georgia. The chance to come back home to Charlotte, my wife and I now are joined with 2 young kids. We grew up in Cornelius, North Carolina, and the chance to come back home to Charlotte, we see the strengths and all the exciting parts of all those unbelievable markets, made some great friends, great relationships, and all those markets across the Southeast Atlantic have their own special charm and distinctive characteristics. I will tell you that maybe I'm biased coming back home to Charlotte. We understand the charm that comes with that has the size and scale with a purpose-built organization like Truist is matched with purpose-built communities with strong leadership, where you got the philanthropic, the civic, and the private partners all working together for a greater cause. There's so much here to offer at Charlotte, but I think the future looks even brighter from what it is today. So we're going to learn a lot from this COVID-19 experience. I'm going to look at the silver lining. We got to get through this, but I'm looking at the silver lining to think I think we get better at this as a community, as neighbors, and as organizations living here in Charlotte.
I'm so glad we're recording that, because we're totally going to build that into our marketing value proposition of the Alliance. Heath, that was perfect. And it certainly was a comprehensive set of factors and things that you as Truist really evaluated on selecting Charlotte for the headquarters. So thank you for sharing that perspective. We're going to come back to you in a minute here. Seth, just given kind of what we just heard from Heath, what does a typical process look like when a business is selecting a market? What are they considering? And I know, but I'd like to hear from you how that varies. What does a typical process look like?
Yeah, I mean, I know you guys have probably heard it all before, but, typically, especially now, a lot of it revolves around labor. The way I look at it is if you can't hire the people that you need, you're going to fail. So that's kind of like number one. When we were doing this, let's say 10 years ago, labor cost was really in there. And I think now people care less about the cost of labor and just more so of the access to that labor. So I think that's probably going to be the number one on a variety of different scales. If you're talking manufacturing, it might be a little bit different as you got things like supply chain, power costs that are all going to be more important. But generally for something that's going to go like into downtown Charlotte, important, and that's what comes up. I mean, the way that I would think about it is companies, for us at least, kind of break up into two buckets. You've got a company that sort of already knows where they want to go or has a pretty good idea of where it's going to be. It's between 2 or 3 cities. Those companies, that's fine. Everybody's got some predetermined markets. That's fine. And then we have other companies that literally are open to wherever. And I would say it's maybe about 50-50, somewhere in there. It kind of changes depending on the year. But for both, we're able to provide that context that says, hey, here are the things you should be looking at. And like you alluded to earlier, labor's on there, but we've also seen things that have gotten more important. We've seen, quality of life used to be sort of really low on the list and sort of bump up. And I think that sort of goes hand in hand with labor. The harder it is to attract labor, the more important the quality of life of where you're going is. And notwithstanding the COVID-19 issues, air accessibility has become really an issue as well. People want to be able to get to go quickly to wherever wherever their new office or new location is. The one thing that I might just say anecdotally about that is that, when I started at CBRE doing what I was doing about 15 years ago, people that were moving out of California were like, all right, we can look at Phoenix and, maybe we'll look at Dallas. That's a long way away. Right. I think that attitude has completely changed. I think if you're on the East Coast or on your West Coast, really the entire country is sort of open. Mm. I think people have gotten and said, if Dallas is a 3.5-hour flight from LA, then Atlanta's another 45 minutes, not really that big of a deal. Charlotte's another 45 minutes. It just sort of is what it is. And people have gotten more comfortable with that. Now, I mean, that might change a little bit after we come out of this. So right. I don't know how that's going to sort of reflect in the next couple of years, but, just some interesting notes there.
Yeah, and do you see that different from headquarters? Since we're talking about headquarter operations today, is Charlotte usually on the list, or does it depend on the headquarter type?
I mean, I would definitely say, there are a bunch of cities when we're looking at headquarters. There's probably like 5 of them, and most of them are on the list you showed earlier. They were always on the list, right? Like you always had Dallas, you usually had Nashville, you always had Charlotte, and you probably always had Atlanta. Because all those cities sort of met all the criteria that I was talking about earlier. I think the interesting thing now is that, I think, like I mentioned earlier, we're still seeing Charlotte and Atlanta in the mix quite a bit. But the new cities that are popping up are sort of interesting. Everybody asks, like, what's the next Austin, right? Or what's the next Dallas? And we have seen cities that, when I say these names, people are like, really? But, we've seen Kansas City come up quite a bit. We've even seen cities like Omaha and, Pittsburgh come up quite a bit as well now. And I think that's where people are looking for sort of the next city where you can get that, lower cost talent that's still willing to work really hard and, has a good quality of life behind them. So, that's part of our job. We're always kind of keeping tabs on what cities are popping up and why. And, I think that's going to continue to evolve over time. And, I think the COVID-19 thing might put a little gas on the accelerator as to some of those new cities that are a little less dense. But, we'll have to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, that is interesting perspective. I've been reading a little bit of literature as well, seeing that, space and physical space because of the coronavirus might actually impact some decisions on real estate, both on the commercial side and the residential side. Thanks for sharing those other markets. I'll definitely be checking out what Kansas City and Omaha and Pittsburgh are doing. Heath, let's come back to you. You mentioned growing up here in Cornelius and for you and your wife to return to Charlotte with Truist's headquarters relocation. But what is it about our city and maybe our broader region that most excites you? And then so far, what's it like to do business here?
Yeah, one, I just think there's a unique, just hospitable community that welcomes everybody. And I was proud to work in some focus groups with the Charlotte Regional Business Alliance and the Center City Partnership recently. Got to get a bunch of leaders together and talk about who we are today in 2020, but what we want to become in 2040. And I think one of the things that there's going to be a lot of competition that never goes away. I think competition makes us better, but the charm and the can-do spirit that is represented here in Charlotte makes you know that, look, it is special to be here. We have a great and vibrant arts community that we need to continue to protect and make sure it prospers. The education platform we have in Charlotte is not only really good, it's only getting better with the expansion of a medical research center and university in the heart of our city of Charlotte. Then you take a look at the diversified economies, and what draws us, we know all the industries in the future will have some technological components to that. So if you tie the technological with this diverse of education, financial services, healthcare, arts, parks, lakes, creeks, streams, all those things is a place that our children want to live and grow and have great neighbors and fun, being out on sidewalks, going to parks. So I think all those position us extremely well for the future. We're really proud to call it home, maybe because of the welcoming spirit. We know that we're better together. We know that as strong as Charlotte has been, we want to be in a part of a purpose-built organization or aspiring purpose-built family. We want to make a difference. And we think the future gets really bright. I think we absolutely can make a difference. And it's just a welcoming community. I would say that also extends to the broader business community. The broader business, philanthropic, and civic community have been so kind to welcome Truist to town. It was the most humbling and honor experience I've ever had when Foundation for the Carolinas, Michael Marsicano joined extensive leaders to host a welcome reception for Truist. And you saw Hugh McCall, Brian Moynihan, the folks from Ally, all the banks were included in that network to say, we understand there's times when we compete, but we also lock arms because we stand for a better Charlotte. I don't know if there's ever been a more meaningful and powerful moment that says, man, that feels like Charlotte. And we're proud to be a part of it. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I'm going to build a little bit more on the quality of life commentary that you just mentioned. And Seth, you touched on it earlier as well. I know in the location factors, when companies are taking a look at those, again, when I started this long ago, quality of life was not typically in your top 10. It was always kind of a nice to have. I remember being in Phoenix, working with Greater Phoenix Economic Council, and we would say, don't put the cactus on there, don't put the saguaro on there. You don't want to remind people we're in the desert. And yet, today, that's a very different feeling because people will relate. They want to explore, they want to go out and see different things. So building some on what Heath said, we know that quality of life matters. And to your earlier comment, we also know talent is going to follow, where it's affordable and where it's a really nice place to enjoy the arts and to see the amenities and eat at all the great restaurants. So there's an interrelated connectivity there. Companies then are obviously going to follow where the talent go. And so what are the other site selection factors that maybe we haven't touched on today? And then kind of round that comment out with, where do incentives play? We know this is a body of expertise that you have at CBRE. So what factors, again, have we not discussed yet? And then how do incentives weigh in?
Yeah, I think our normal model now has something like 75 different elements into it. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into the modeling. Just a quick note on quality of life, things like restaurants per capita or golf courses per capita or parks per capita. All those things were not things we used to look at like 10, 15 years ago. And now those are all sort of standard. So those definitely are important. The one thing I'll just mention is that I think the data is fine. It'll show you sort of what the actual stats say, but that doesn't replace what it's like to actually go there. So I think a lot of the decision-making processes around actually getting on the ground, experiencing the city for yourself. I mean, you'd be surprised. We get clients based in New York or San Francisco or Seattle, and they think like Atlanta or Charlotte's just like a tiny town in the South. I think that you'd be surprised actually, but that happens. And I think they're really surprised when they get on the ground and they see what's going on. So, I mean, that's something to take into account. It's a big country with a lot of different viewpoints, right? On top of that, there are a lot of other things that we take into account. Like you mentioned before, economic incentive availability is on there. I would say beyond that, though, is more of like ease of doing business, tax environment. Like I said before, air accessibility is becoming more and more important. We're seeing things like, like public transit availability, green initiatives, political, I don't want to call it political persuasion, but, politically, what's the environment there and is your culture? So a lot of these things, like even like union environment, those all come up. So there's a variety of issues. What I would say with regards to your question on incentives is if a company comes to us and says, we want to go where the best incentives are, for us, that's a huge red flag. We just say, why is that? What research have you done? For me, at least mostly in my experience, 95% of the projects we work on, you'll get two cities that compare against each other very very evenly, and the incentives can make the deal, it's like the cherry on top of the sundae, is the saying, right? It makes the deal a little bit better in one place than the other. I would say even with that, I don't think incentives, and I don't mean to say anything controversial here, but really push the decision one way or the other. I think it makes a decision a little bit easier to make. In some cases, you get incentives that are specifically tied to an industry, and it's like a no-brainer. You have to go there because, it's some sales tax abatement, and you've got huge capital purchases, and that's something that you just have to do. So that'll happen every once in a while. But generally, for cities that stack up against each other pretty evenly, the incentives just end up being like the cherry on top and really kind of push you one way or the other. What I would say is, at least in my experience, is the companies that have relatively aggressive economic incentive programs tend to be the ones that are very business friendly, right? Are they offering economic incentives to support the company? But usually, those are the states where the governor might get on the phone and call or attend a site visit, and they make things easier for the transition of your employees. Any administrative questions or questions you have about the city or the state, they're quick to answer. All that shows up when you're trying to decide which city to go to. So I think those things go hand in hand, and maybe they get lost a little bit in between. But like I said, it's not the for sure deal maker in most cases.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, I know I didn't show this slide, but one of our findings also showed that that ease of doing business that you mentioned, that business friendliness was not always defined by incentives. It was oftentimes the business empathy piece, that local government or state government would just get it, that it's a great place to be, and they would pick up the phone call and welcome you, or do what they can to make themselves available. I know when Nikki Haley was in the governor's office in South Carolina, it was prior to my time here in the Carolinas, she has a reputation for giving out her cell phone number and making herself available to potential companies, prospective companies. So, kind of on that note, how has your experience with local government been here so far?
Like I've mentioned earlier, Janet, I feel blessed to work in a lot of different markets and had such a positive experience in every one of those. It was a lesson learned that you can find happiness anywhere. And for those in every market that grew up in those home markets, they're pretty passionate about why their city is the best. I will tell you, though, there has been a big difference in experiences learning on that journey about when you have state and local governments, when they work together and they agree that it's okay to disagree, but focus their energies on where there's a common agreement, is amazing what communities can do. I've seen it in some, I've seen it in others where it hasn't worked. In Charlotte, I will tell you that it seems like certainly in the local Charlotte markets, the county and the city, the corporate citizens, the philanthropic. I don't know that I've ever been in a community that's more cohesive, that doesn't always agree on everything. There's no doubt about it, but focus the energy and respectfully, where they disagree, you respectfully disagree, but focus your energy where you can make a difference. So I think that has been absolutely refreshing here in the Charlotte market. And we look forward to seeing what we can do to help prosper and continue to grow those partnerships as well.
Yeah, you guys have already had such a fantastic entree into the Charlotte region, and certainly in the city of Charlotte and Mecklenburg County. And so we really appreciate the early support that you guys have lent to our nonprofit community here, and then especially in your response with COVID-19. And kind of on that note, and as it relates to, Seth, some of the modeling that you mentioned of the various site factors that go into the process, what is your early take on the coronavirus? And my team has heard from the site selection community in some circles that how markets respond to the coronavirus is going to be something that you're paying attention to. It shows a willingness and signals whether a market can collaborate and can work swiftly to support businesses. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, if I really 100% knew, I'd probably be investing and I'd be rich, right? But I think you sort of see things that are all over the place, right? I think something you're definitely going to see is at least companies are going to start reconsidering having a super dense workforce in one city. So, people, companies that have everybody in San Francisco or everybody in New York, and they're all packed into one office building, probably not a great idea in the current situation. I tend to be a little bit more subdued about it. I don't think it's going to have these like massive impacts that it will. I tend to think that people tend to return back to normal pretty quickly. But that being said, I think you are going to see some sort of stratification or diversification of people of companies out of big cities, just to be less dense. And, that might look like putting a second HQ somewhere. That might look like working from home more, or some sort of combination in between. So I think you're going to see that on the office side for sure. The second thing that I think you're going to see, again, this is not any news to anybody, but, I think supply chain is going to change quite a bit. I know it's going to impact industrial more than anything, but I think having a lot of our, what you would call essential materials manufactured abroad, especially in Asia, is sort of dangerous in some respects. I don't know if dangerous is the right term, but risky, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be pushed back. I think you'll see more inventory being held in the United States. I think you'll see more manufacturing in the United States. I mean, generally, it's going to mean that things are going to get more expensive here that we purchase, but I think people are probably willing to pay that extra dollar or whatever it is to have some sort of, made in USA type, supply chain security. So I think you'll see that. Honestly, though, I don't know. I actually think the biggest question is, everyone's got a crash course in working from home all of a sudden, right? And companies have been able to do it pretty well, I think. Notwithstanding the questions around being able to build out bandwidth across the country so that we can do that easier, I think the question is how much people are going to adopt that. I think a company say, hey, we're going to go like 100% work from home. And a lot of other companies that have said, we're going to bring people back when we can. I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle. Right. I think it's going to be quite as widespread as people think. I think regardless, I think people are just social animals. I think they want to get together every once in a while and talk, share a meal. Even now, I mean, that seems, I've been in California. I've been in lockdown for like 6 or 7 weeks now. It seems crazy, the idea of going to a restaurant, but I think that's going to happen eventually again. So, you'll see some changes like I mentioned, but I personally think it's not going to be these massive shifts that, you see in the news.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And again, I won't put Heath on the spot there as they're starting to occupy a really nice new tower, but we'll hold that for a minute. We're actually at time to open it up to audience Q&A. So I think I'll pause there and let's see. I think if Blake and John might be moderating or fielding any questions from the audience.
This is Steve Garrett. I've unmuted myself. I'll check for questions. I have a question, one of my own. I've talked to some folks in other markets that have said that they've been very successful in the past at attracting major employers, and it's become a problem for them because their labor market is perceived as saturated, and their market is also perceived as one that can't attract large volume of relocation of new of new folks to the market. And so their past success is hurting them. So it's kind of a question for Janet and Seth. How important is a community's ability to attract labor independent of the relocation?
Seth, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's critically important. And I think the way that I think about it is a lot of companies ask us, okay, if we relocate, I'm just making this up, from Seattle or New York to a new city, how many people are going to come? And my first question is, well, what city? Because, it's better to, some people really might want to live in Austin and, no offense, but some people might not want to live in like Albuquerque or wherever, I don't mean that negatively, but, it might be the reverse as well. But I think personally, especially now, your ability as a city to attract talent from across the country, not just regionally, is more and more important as people are willing to move more and more. So I think those cities that, to me, it's the cities that have like some sort of big cultural event. You get like the Kentucky Derby in Louisville is a good example. People know Louisville because of the Kentucky Derby, and it really sort of helps sell. There are great things in Louisville as well, but, that helps that process. So I think, I think personally, I think that's just important. Your ability to sort of have that message out there on a national level really does help, help your city's availability to win projects, I guess I would say.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that, Steve, thanks for the question. We alluded to it earlier that, Charlotte, the region itself is attracting something like 100 people every day. And, I think it's great to be in a metro area where you are seeing that type of gravity pull. I moved here from Portland and then Phoenix before that. So again, being in other markets where you were seeing pretty rapid population growth year over year. I don't necessarily think Charlotte's going to have an issue with that. I think our bigger challenge to it would be our ability to develop our homegrown workforce and making sure that we are taking care of the folks who are in the Carolinas who really need to fully participate in the economy. So we need to be able to both attract and develop, I think, the workforce that we have here. But I have great confidence in our higher education institutions. As Heath mentioned earlier, we have a medical school coming online here, and I think with UNC Charlotte and then the rest of the 29 higher education institutions, we have a great talent story to share. We just have to continue to do a good job on that affordability measure, and again, that's related to the amount of folks coming in. We have to find and strike that right balance, which is going to take both a policy and a place-making quality of life approach. Okay, I think we've got a question here in the chat room. This is directed at Seth, coming from John. So I'm curious, Charlotte had several tech-specific jobs announcements over the past year. Are West Coast-based companies taking more of a look at Charlotte for software jobs now? What's changed? And did Austin get too expensive, or was talent finally realized?
I think generally, kind of alluding to the point I made earlier, I think California or West Coast-based companies are willing to look further east than they ever have been. And I think that's really sort of more of a search for talent more than anything. Examples, and I think this is part of the problem with California, is that, Apple opened an office in in Austin, have 500 people, and then 500 will turn to 1,000, and 1,000 will turn to 2,000. And, California doesn't see that as lost jobs because it was kind of like a satellite office that really grew. But I mean, those jobs could have been in California and they're not. So, I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic. What I will say is that, like I was saying earlier, cities like Austin have gotten very, very expensive. And a lot of cities that have grown quickly have outgrown their infrastructure very fast. So, traffic in Austin is way worse than it used to be. The city of Austin itself has basically said, we're not going to support anything with incentives anymore. We're sort of overgrown as it is, and we don't need to do it. And they're probably right. From an economic development perspective, they don't need to facilitate that anymore. I think on top of that, real estate in Austin, I'm not sure like last quarter, but, a couple quarters ago, was more expensive than downtown LA. So you've gotten a lot of things that have gotten more expensive very quickly in that city. So I think cities are just looking, or companies are looking to diversify more, which is why you're seeing, cities like Charlotte and Atlanta, start to get really big tech announcements because they're just other areas that have normally been seen as tech hubs are getting overcrowded. So, if you want to be a big fish in a medium pond as opposed to a big fish in a big pond, those options are available out there.
Okay. Another question in the chat room. We have a lot of architects and general contractors as a part of our chapter. How much does construction costs and unionized labor factor into selecting a city?
You want me to take that one?
I do.
I would think so. Not so much on the construction. Well, I guess unionized labor on the construction side, I'm not sure is that big of an issue. You know, every once in a while we run into it, but I don't know that it's that big of an item. You know, unionized labor, if you're opening like a manufacturing plant, is definitely a big item. You know, right to work state versus not right to work state is definitely going to come up. And even sometimes we're looking at the number of positive union or pro-union votes versus non-union votes in a given state or community. So we track that pretty closely. As you can imagine, manufacturers are very concerned about what that environment looks like because that impacts your ability to produce, you know, the cost to produce, right? You know, with regards to construction cost, you know, I think that comes up quite a bit, although I would say that the majority of cities that we're looking at, it's not very often where we have like, I would say like New York versus LA versus Omaha, you know, where you've got like a really big disparity in construction costs. You know, usually it's like Omaha versus Louisville versus Kansas City, and the disparity is instead of 20%, it's like 2%. So I think that comes up less, but I will say that construction costs is definitely something that we look at and we monitor pretty closely in case one place gets, you know, significantly out of whack. I would say this is probably a good ancillary point to this, is that construction cost is not necessarily a big issue, but construction timing is very big. Mm-hmm. If you're a city or, you know, a public agency that's trying to approve permits or whatnot, and you can't move fast, especially in this environment, that's really, really problematic. You know, a lot of times companies are saying, hey, we need to be up and running in 9 months, a year, and we're already 6 months behind when we get that first phone call. So the minute that you say like, well, it's going to take a little bit longer than normal for this permit, or a little bit longer for us to get this in place, or you've got some environmental hurdle that we need to clear, you know, all those things sort of stack up on the scale. And once you get over the point where the company just says, we're not going to even consider that city anymore, it's too risky, that is definitely something that we look very, very closely at, because that's sort of a yes/no decision as opposed to where do you rank on the scale.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, Seth. Again, as we define business empathy, it really is getting to the yes. And so I think that does factor in more specifically to things like, you know, facilitating that permitting or somehow accelerating that, which are the controls that really local government can easily play and turn on. So I would agree with that point. We have a question in here from Joel that we talked a little bit about strategic value earlier, and could we define that a bit? And Joel, thanks for that question regarding the Alliance research, and then I'll ask Beth if he has any perspective, and even Heath. The definition I think could vary, but in our own survey, that was really, again, around being proximal to your customers. It was a combination of that plus cost plus accessibility, I think, through transportation networks, and I would define that broadly. For us, it is certainly an asset, again, to have Charlotte Douglas here, but the fact that we do have a really well-connected transportation system, the ability to move goods and people pretty easily was something that gets defined and bucketed into that strategic value set. Seth, I don't know if there's anything that you would add there, or Heath, even from your experience of strategic value when it comes to the Charlotte market.
I mean, the way that I would say it is, you know, we're looking always on a spectrum, right? So you've got like your really risky cities that are super cheap. And then you've got like your really less risky cities that are pretty expensive. And somewhere in the middle there is like where you have to help, we help our clients decide where they want to be on that spectrum. And really the strategic value, I'll call it strategic value cities, are the ones that are still relatively cheap, but have a lot of qualitative value, right? So that's really what we're looking for. And Charlotte's really been on that list for quite a while. So, you know, to me, that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, you know, the only thing I would add is, Seth, you've talked about it, but I would probably just paraphrase it from my terminology or our terminology is the valuation is measured in a broad context of political climate, business climate, which is all the regulatory stuff that comes in. If you put those two better, you need a thriving economic prospering community. You can't have a prospering community. And to Janet alluded to this economic mobility situation, we've enjoyed a lot of success in Charlotte, but the studies in retrospect said we imported the talent as opposed to growing it from within. You probably need to do both. So if we do those, we've got the infrastructure to do it. You've got the airports, you've got really good interstate capabilities with some growing alternate transportation, quality of life, the ultimate cost of what it takes to live. I think all those are bundled into quality of life. That's how we would view the overall valuation of the workforce. And I also think I'll just jump in about the technological growth of companies choosing Charlotte. I mean, financial services is absolutely, we could be one of the larger fintech companies in the United States if isolated just from our technological platforms. So I think for technological employers or employees in that industry, your opportunities from employment drastically increase when you have all the innovation and technology associated with education, healthcare, financial services districts. All those reasons make Charlotte a viable solution going forward.
Awesome. Hey, we've got just a few minutes left, and I know we have some closing comments, so I'm just going to try to squeeze in one more question here, and I'm actually going to go over to, it's for Seth. Let's see if I can scroll back up and find it. It was regarding how Charlotte, I think, stacks up in terms of our transportation infrastructure. Seth, any site selection thoughts on that, how our transportation system stacks up?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously the airport, and that's a positive. You know, I think that's a good thing to have no matter what city you are. And with regards to public transit within the city itself, you know, I would argue, and I don't mean to have sort of a pessimist answer here, but there's only like a handful of cities in the United States that have public transit that's broad enough where you can really go anywhere. You know, New York is an example of one of them, right? And I don't think there's a whole lot like that. You know, and no offense, but I don't think transit in Charlotte is like you can just go anywhere you are and end up somewhere else really easily. Mm-hmm. Well, do it, but you're going to have to take quite a few connections. What I would say is Charlotte and the cities that stack up against Charlotte normally, you know, I think companies appreciate the fact that they're building it out. You know, I don't think anybody assumes that it's going to be done, but the fact that if you live in certain, you know, neighborhoods that have access to the transit core, you know, that just makes life a lot easier for your employee base. So I think the fact that you're moving in that direction is definitely a positive. I don't think anybody expects the answer to be done tomorrow, but I think that, you know, that it's available in certain cases is just something that companies are looking for.
That's great insight. Well, y'all, thank you so much for joining us. And I'd like to, before I turn it back over to Steve to close, just everyone just give a little round of applause for Heath and Seth. And thank you so much for spending your time with us.
Agree. There's a reaction at the bottom. I'll give a shout out. There you go.
All right.
Thank you
for great work. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Heath. Guys, I've been monitoring our participants. We've consistently been over 100 participants on this call. We are ecstatic about that on the programs committee, and we want to thank everybody for participating. We will send out a follow-up like we always do. And I know by now you guys are probably all Zoom and Microsoft Teams and GoToMeeting experts. So we on the programs committee really look at this as an opportunity to kind of add this as another tool that we can provide programming for our members. And we're excited about that. This is a really effective, low-cost way for us to add it. It's not lost on us that we still understand that our members want that physical contact when we're allowed to do that again. But we would really like your feedback on this program. And if you've got any technical advice, because I know you guys are all experts, we would love to hear it. But thanks to our panelists today, and thank you to our sponsors, and thanks to everybody. I hope everybody stays safe and sane. And we look forward. Our next meeting is in June. We're still trying to figure out what we're going to be doing in June, but my guess is today it's probably going to be another virtual meeting. So we'll be sending out information on that meeting relatively soon. So thanks, everybody, and we look forward to next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.